All right. So today we're going to start by addressing an ongoing argument, the discussion, let's say, that we were having informally. And during that discussion, Harold brought up a recent YouTube by John Mearsheimer. And it was interesting in that it directly challenged the presentation that we've been following with Timothy Snyder. So it's a really clear counterpoint to what he had to say. So I thought it'd be useful before we dive back into California to at least look at the two arguments that were just restated recently, considering the events since February. So let's go back to February. And Germany is an important player, especially in Timothy Snyder's recounting of the last century. So let's just start with February 15th, when Chancellor Scholz visits Putin, and Putin tells him he doesn't want war. And then nine days later, he invades. So, and this recalls the very interesting relationship between former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who was a social democrat, and he has formed a business relationship with Putin, and he has been the link to Europe on the pipeline, the gas pipeline, the one that dramatically got closed down after Putin invaded. And of course, Putin's been closing down the first one just as a political ploy. But Schroeder refused to condemn Putin because he's his man. He's getting paid $1 million salary, and if he hasn't, he may have made $1 billion by now. But if you look closely at this interesting relationship between a former chancellor of Germany and Putin, there's a continuity that's called Ostpolitik, the politics of the East. I was in Berlin when Willy Brandt was the mayor, and he was a darling of the Social Democrats, the socialists. And for him, Ostpolitik represented an enlightened reconciliation after two world wars. And it was considered back in the 60s and 70s as progressive. But in fact, it started earlier. Ostpolitik started all the way back a century ago, around the First World War. Because of Russia's natural resources, which is a continuing issue, Germany had been trading for those natural resources for ever. And in 1910, Germany was Russia's top trading partner. And this is Robert Schmidt, who first enunciated Ostpolitik. And the interesting thing is that it continued this sort of colonial collaboration between Germany and Russia in the exploitation of the Ukraine continued all the way through. And this is Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, and how the world wars were really fights over the resources of the Ukraine, and the thing that that bound Russia and Germany together was petrochemicals. We've just reached the part in Ramsey's Silk Roads where oil is coming onto the scene. You'll remember that our last few chapters we read how oil had replaced coal in the British Navy, and it was considered strategic to have oil supplies. And Ramsey hinted that the rest of the Silk Roads book is going to center around oil and petrochemicals. And boy, oh boy, did it drive Bloodlands, and it's a factor today in the politics. Timothy Snyder points out that maybe it was an inadvertent collaboration. Maybe Willy Brandt went to Moscow for ideological reasons, to ask for Moscow's forgiveness for Hitler. But as long as you're going to Moscow, you get natural gas. And he points out any Marxist would have made that point. And then Snyder points out that Germany never came to terms with its relationship to the Ukraine post World War II. Part of it was the continuation of Ostpolitik, as led by Willy Brandt. And what should have started as a discussion in 1991, the year that Ukraine became an independent country, Germany should have had an agonizing reappraisal about their relationship. And they didn't. They did not. So Mearsheimer, he hears Timothy Snyder's point of view. It goes against, he is a realist in the tradition of Kissinger, balance of power. And Harold sent us this link to watch it. So I watched it, and Mearsheimer put up some slides. And so I'm going to show some of Mearsheimer's slides as a counterpoint to Timothy Snyder's argument. And then at the end, I'm going to come in with Timothy Snyder's counter argument. So we're going to go back and forth a couple of times. So Mearsheimer reviews the events that we're familiar with from our first run through the history of contemporary Ukraine and what happened in the Maidan revolt, and how Russia grabbed the Crimea. Nothing in dispute there, but he goes after the conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom is Putin is the main cause, or that Putin is crazy, or that Putin is bent on creating a greater Russia, or Putin bears a marked resemblance to Hitler, which is Timothy Snyder's argument. Russism is really fascism in disguise. He denies all of this, Mearsheimer does, and says that Putin is acting rationally as any great power would. And Kissinger says the same thing. And you'll remember when we went through Putin's biography, Kissinger and Putin met in the early 1990s. Putin was a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, and Kissinger was coming as a consultant, and Putin picked him up at the airport. And they had this long conversation, and Kissinger sympathized with what happened to the sudden loss of power of the Soviet Union. He said it was too fast. that there should have been more balance of power. And that, of course, is Putin's argument today. The second tier of conventional wisdom that Mearsheimer thinks is wrong is that the United States is benign, seeking merely to promote European stability. And that Putin's recent behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO to try to include Ukraine and Georgia. And Mearsheimer thinks that's backward. That's the wrong way around. He thinks that America's aggressive tendencies by expanding NATO so quickly, and we went over the maps of how quickly that was done, and there's no doubt about it. And George Kennan commented on it at the time. Mearsheimer wasn't by himself at all. And that Putin reaction was predictable, and that he is behaving rationally. Of course, we went back through all of Putin's grievances, and that began with our bombing of Serbia in 1999, which just turbocharged the grievance against the expansion of NATO. And then Mearsheimer is critical of the West's response so far, that we're doubling down on Ukraine. We're sending them all these weapons. He thinks we're playing a losing hand because, number one, Russia has the petro energy. And number two, they care more about Ukraine than we're going to care in a year or 5 years. And so he thinks we're playing a losing hand as a realist. But even if we're playing a winning hand, that could be dangerous, because if Putin is cornered, he's made very clear that he would use nuclear weapons. He says he would. Now, we don't know if it's a bluff, but we do know, and as when we went deep into the Russian Orthodox religion, that they have an admiral who is the saint of nuclear weapons. We remember how odd that was. But that's a big part of Putin's strategy. He's got that ace in the hole. Now, this is Mearsheimer talking about Obama's behavior in 1914, and that Obama was being aggressive the way we were in the Cold War to try to contain Russia. Mearsheimer thinks that is too aggressive, that it's not a matter of containing Russia. We should be recognizing their legitimate claims as a hegemon, as a great power in their own backyard, just like we did when Russia tried to put missiles into Cuba. The Monroe Doctrine is, after all, our standard, and what Putin is doing in the Ukraine is nothing more than their Monroe Doctrine. And Mearsheimer is very critical that we're trying to put together an international consensus against Russia, that we're even trying to seduce China away. And China is now solidly in Russia's camp. Putin played that card well in advance. He lined up that duck in a row before he took aggressive action. But Mearsheimer is saying, as a realist, our long-term threat is China, and we should be doing the opposite. we should be courting Russia to line up with us against China. That's how backwards he thinks our long-term strategy is. And also we need Russia to control Iran. And they were a part of the negotiation that Trump tore up. In Mearsheimer's view, you should just create a neutral Ukraine, which is what we did with Austria finally in 1955 with Khrushchev. We compromised on Austria. They could be a member of the EU, but not a member of NATO. So he thinks we should give Ukraine the same deal. And that might have been possible before Putin did what he did. But that horse has left the barn. And he thinks that nevertheless, Ukraine should be a buffer state between NATO and Russia. And he draws a little diagram for us that NATO is France, Germany, and Poland. That should be sufficient. Ukraine should be a buffer state in between Russia and NATO. But he sees what we're trying to do now as dangerous, that we're pulling West Ukraine. We'll never get all of Ukraine now, especially if Russia's occupying 20% of the country. But directly border of a NATO country versus Russia is very dangerous in his view. And so abandon NATO expansion, put together an economic rescue plan, and guarantee a minority rights for Russians in the remaining part of the Ukraine. Of course, Zelensky speaks Russian and was brought up speaking Russian. So this claim that Russian speakers are discriminated against is questionable. Then Mearsheimer asks these questions. Will there be a new Cold War? He says no. Russia's not strong enough. Will the US still pivot to China, to Asia? Yes, they will, because that's the long-term threat. If we pivot to Asia, the implications for NATO are not good, but they can hold together a truly defensive alliance against Russian aggression. If we pivot to Asia, that's great for our Asian allies, including Japan and India, to say nothing of Korea, South Korea. And the implications for Iran and Syria, we've just seen that Biden engineered a visit to Saudi Arabia. And what did Putin do the next day? He arrived in Tehran. And what we have now in the Middle East is a face-off between the Semitic tribes and the Persians, which goes back a very long period of time, centuries. And there's something now called the Abraham Accords, where the Semitic tribes are getting together again, and that includes Israel. The Jewish Semites are part of the Abraham Accord. And so now you see the Semitic tribes reorganizing and with America on the side of the Abraham Accords and Russia being forced to side with Iran. And that's a real trigger point for war as well. So is Crimea lost to Russia for good? Yes. Mearsheimer says, yes, it is. And what are the implications for the Ukraine? Mearsheimer says they can get along just fine as a neutral country, just like the Austrians are now, and have their own culture and join the EU. So Snyder's response was given really in an interview with a Kyiv political scientist in Kyiv. And this is the link. I sent it around. And he has come up with a new term, Russism, which is Russian ideology, which is, if you look at it, has all the elements of fascism, imperialism, militarism, racism. And it doesn't leave any room for an actual civic Ukrainian nation, which has existed now for over 30 years. And as we started off talking about, Ostpolitik has continued until February. And only after Russia invaded the Ukraine has Ostpolitik been questioned, and Germany is coming to terms with their historic collaboration as laid out over at least the last century, as laid out by Timothy Snyder. So why is there this difference in opinion? And that question came up in the interview, and the interviewer said, why are people like Noam Chomsky of the American left seeming to side with Russia? And it's not that they're siding with Russia, to be fair to Mearsheimer. It's that they're realists that are looking at the politics, the geography, the motivation. And does this relate to the generations? Does this have anything to do with the so-called Cold War generation? Snyder says no. Snyder, forget all that. Snyder says the main factor is that the American leftists have not been to the Ukraine. So they don't see Ukrainians as agents, having agency, as being actors. They don't know the Ukrainian language. Snyder does. Snyder's lived in Ukraine. Ukraine has been his specialty. And he used the history of the Ukraine to describe the more general concepts of tyranny, a book that Aiko and Carol have read. And he built it into a political philosophy, really, centered in what happened in the Bloodlands. And that because the Ukrainians have some agency, you just should not be persuaded that you have to accept some Russian view of the history of the Ukraine. And that right now, Russia can declare all at once, but it's more about action. And he doubts that Russia can sustain morale and action in the Ukraine. And so there's a disagreement over who's motivated, that the Russians care more about Ukraine than we do. Well, that may be beside the point. Who cares the most about the Ukraine are the Ukrainians. And they have taken action using their Cossack heritage, as we've talked about before. And the strength of Ukraine is their belief in the future, not about myths of the past. And this is something that Snyder made in a more general context of tyranny, that tyrants usually try to control the masses by myths about the past, make America great again, for instance. But action that's directed at the future. And that requires more person-to-person contact to understand ideas that the Ukrainians have about the future. The people who don't have a sense of any future are oligarchs and autocrats. For them, what's the future? They don't have an ideology. And so this is, I think, his central quote against the realists, that he's uncomfortable with people dictating to the Ukrainians what reality is, and that they have to accommodate yourself, as if you're saying, oh, you're just a small, unimportant country, just adjust. And Snyder says that's imperial. That's imperial. So he criticizes our left, the people like Chomsky, who he accuses of engaging in inverted nationalism. They start with the assumption that everything America does in the world is bad. And if America is responsible for everything, then they don't make room for the agency of others. And so this amounts to imperialism in reverse. And they share, it's kind of perverse that the American left shares the same imperialist assumptions that the right wing does, that America is the indispensable country that has to be responsible. Not the Trumpian right wing, mind you, but certainly the traditional Republican right wing. But the real problem is nobody knows anything about Ukrainian history. And I'll admit, when we were going through it, I found it jaw-dropping, how interesting it was, and some of the maps that Ramsey put up, absolutely astounding. So we learned to not accept the simple narratives like Ukraine has never existed. Or that Ukrainian culture has always been part of Russian cultures. We went through Putin's speech from the previous July, paragraph by paragraph, and showed where he was wrong. There's a larger question about dealing with the inconvenient truths of history. So it's like teaching slavery, and obviously people are very uncomfortable about that, and it's going to be an election issue. But Snyder points out your own history is always uncomfortable, but if you deny your own history, then you have no ground to point out the imperfections in China and Russia's history. But in any case, Russia's rewriting of history, we just shouldn't accept it. And Russians can't talk about their Holocaust, where so many Ukrainians starved to death. It's different than the Holocaust. They call it a holodomor, which was the intentional starving of the kulaks, the small farmers, by the communists. So he recommends that we just have to rewire the way we look at at history and the way we teach it. We have to change our teaching methods entirely if we're going to be able to deal with something like Russia exerting its strength. And that we should use Russia as a cracked mirror. I love that metaphor. So we should take pride in what we've always held out as a principle, equality, certainly equality of opportunity. The left should hold out the principle of individual freedom. And in this sense, Russia's like a cracked mirror. They have a really crummy oligarchy that is take over the country. They have no real future with that. There's no enterprise. And if we see what is the wrong thing to do, and Russia is a model for the wrong thing to do, what are we going to do about our own oligarchy? And so he recommends that we look at Russia that way. The other thing he points out is so much of this is personal, and this is the risk when another country is taken over by one man who has all the power. It's his pet peeves that drive the nation. And that was certainly true of Mao Zedong in the Cultural Revolution. Just his ideas messed up China for a generation. People didn't go to school. It was awful. And that's what happens when one man has so much power. And if the West has done anything, it's the peaceful passage of power. But we saw that was challenged even in our own country. The age of the strongman, as one new book puts it. We had our strongmen too. So Putin was offended by the Orange Revolution, and that personal trauma has become the basis of policy. And he's able to project that policy throughout his own country and onto a neighboring country. And that's what caused World War II, when one rogue alpha male just with his charisma took over a country. And so that's really what we're up against. And if we're on the left and we believe in equality and we believe in freedom, we should believe in the peaceful passage of power and do whatever we can to support the agency of small nations who don't want to accept the geopolitical realities, quote unquote. So the other question that comes up is COVID affecting Putin? And well, the very reason we asked that question, Snyder's very lyrical. He says that's the kind of question that Shakespeare would ask in a play. Is he sick? That's the nature of tyranny, that you'd even ask that kind of question. He does not think so. He thinks that COVID certainly accelerated a process of Putin isolating himself and taking over power and taking no counsel. It was already going on, but it accelerated it. So this is a manifestation of Putin's insecurity. Here he is walking through doors. I think that's a fake. I couldn't find any source for it. So he makes an interesting point about first looking at history, but what does history tell us about where we should be going? And he says the 21st century should be post-imperial, enough of strongmen in other countries deciding what smaller neighbor countries should do. We should support the creation of small countries, even if they're not homogeneous, and let them work through creatively the legacy of empire. And he gives an interesting example: the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Habsburg monarchy. They were very durable, and they were more durable than nation states. We saw the Ottoman Empire, multi-ethnic, more durable than nation states. And this is the key point of his political philosophy. Decentralization is important, because it's only in a world where there's decentralization that a country like Ukraine is possible. And the problem with the war, he's very philosophical about wars. For wars, we've always had. Wars will probably always be with us, unfortunately. But wars have to be lost for history to progress. Otherwise, we're stuck with the politics of eternity. So this is Snyder becoming lyrical again. And it's imperialism that always recycles the past. And that's what Putin's doing. European countries, to stop being imperial, had to lose their wars for empire. And of course, the American Revolution is an example of one of those wars. France had to lose in Algeria and Vietnam. Germany, to be Germany, they had to lose on the East Front, where they had been very strong, going back to Frederick the Great. For the Netherlands to be the Netherlands, they had to lose in Indonesia, Portugal, and Spain. In Africa, there had to be wars of independence in the New World. It's not a sufficient condition for transformation, losing a war, but it's a necessary one. And he's very philosophical about it. This is the way it goes. This is the nature of human beings and the struggle for power. He's very much against the American left's blaming of America for everything, and not giving the Ukrainians agency. Independence. And so we're being guilty of doing the same thing to the Ukrainians that the Germans did. And so this is the final slide. Timothy Snyder is heartened by our support for Ukraine. So you couldn't have a more stark contrast laid out between these two people, Mearsheimer and Timothy Snyder. So I've been talking a lot, and I just wonder if anybody else has anything that they want to say.
I wonder what Timothy Snyder will add at the bottom. For America to be America, what are we going to have to lose?
Well, you could argue we've already lost. We've lost
Vietnam.
Afghanistan, we lost Vietnam. Iraq is the jury's still out, but we certainly lost in Libya, the Middle East, supporting rebels in Syria. We're on a losing streak already. And I think we're responding to that. I mean, the response to Russia's invasion has been a remarkable turnaround from a president who doubted whether NATO was even necessary to one that is put it at the center. And NATO's never been stronger thanks to Putin.
Refresh my memory about Georgia, though. I mean, obviously, our response is very different from Georgia versus Ukraine. Ukraine's bigger. They're putting up a bigger fight. The people are. And, you know, they've got more resources to share with the world than Georgia.
Well, Mearsheimer's point about Georgia was we invited Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. And I think the incitement for that was in 2007, Putin showed up at the Munich conference, and John McCain was sitting in the front row, and he lectured John McCain on America's arrogance, in particular Iraq, and I share Putin's disdain for American arrogance in Iraq, but also,
well, they did the same thing in Afghanistan.
Well, Afghanistan, you'll remember, was not something that upset Putin. Why? Because they had their own problems with Muslim extremists, and I think Chechnya, and so that was one thing. And then they had been defeated in Afghanistan themselves by the Mujahideen. So they were not upset. And after 9/11, you'll remember from a previous lecture, Putin traveled to the United States with his wife, and they laid wreaths at 9/11, and they went on a tour of the United States. So he wasn't upset about that. But Iraq was the worst. And then he thought we were behind all the color revolutions. He took the Orange Revolution in 2004 personally and tried to poison the Democrat with, you remember, ricin that gave him really a bad case of acne. And so we should have known he was a bad dude starting then. But he certainly responded to our invitation by invading Georgia. And it's not like Georgia was blameless. Once we said, we will support your entrance into NATO, Saakashvili decided to be more aggressive in South Ossetia. And so you could argue that Russia was being defensive in a former Soviet republic when Georgia was making trouble on the border, and Abkhazia as well. So that was complicated. But then all hell broke loose in the election of 2011 in Russia, when protests broke out against Putin. And he saw the hand of our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, behind the protesters. And especially our ambassador, who's a Stanford professor, Michael McFaul. He in particular hated Michael McFaul. Michael McFaul was a hawk on Russia, well known. He was on the Security Council first. So it was foreign and domestic that set Putin off. So it was a combination.
Well, and we probably should have listened to George Kennan and not expand NATO as he recommended. But I mean, there was a little bit of gloating, with Poland being part of NATO now, and the Baltic countries, and little. I could see Putin's annoyance.
Well, but how many times has Poland been dismembered by Russia and Germany and Austro-Hungary? How many times has Poland been invaded by Russia? There is the murder of the Polish officers in Katyn Forest. There's any number of incidents. And so you can bet that the first chance the Poles got, and that was a slam dunk. There was hardly any protest at the time when Poland and the Baltic states were the first to sign up. It was when arguably some of the other less directly affected countries began to move towards NATO. I think Romania, but obviously Ukraine was taken as a Cuban type of intervention.
Yes, well, you're dealing then with former Soviet Republic. It was a completely different animal.
Yeah. And
I mean, the Soviet Republic, in which Khrushchev had risen.
Yeah.
And Georgia, a Soviet Republic, arguably, through which maybe Stalin had risen.
Yeah.
He didn't really rise through Georgia.
No.
Yeah.
But Khrushchev did.
Yeah, and it is interesting that Khrushchev is the one that engineered, number one, Crimea being administered by the Ukrainian Soviet, which at the time was like saying, hey, we're moving an Air Force base from Arizona to California, right? But then when Arizona became a different country, they say, we want our Air Force base back. So there was that. But Khrushchev was smart enough to compromise on Austria. I think he had to. It was so far away, and it was costing him so much money.
But now, isn't it almost too late to expect Russia to agree to Ukraine being neutral?
Well, that's why you fight wars when nobody can agree. So I think Timothy Snyder's all in, and I in an interview in May, he predicted that this was the month that Putin, just looking at the long-term prospects and the morale and the material, that this is the month where Putin has to declare victory and leave. And if he stays longer and doubles down on a force, that he's Timothy Snyder said he's going to lose.
Well, except the thing is that as winter approaches and there's no Russian gas for the Europeans, that's going to be a major thing too.
Yeah.
The way, I mean, depends on who can hold their breath the longest, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's.
How quickly are the other countries moving away from that gas? How quickly are we able to ship, or other countries ship other supplies? And I mean, China's going to be really gouging Russia for, for the gas that they're able to get. And the other question is, the Ukrainians know what the Russians have done to the cities that they've taken over. Why would you surrender? I mean,
Yeah.
I'd be out there making sandwiches for those soldiers, and I'd be making the Molotov cocktails. I can't throw them, but I could make them.
Yeah.
You know what's going to happen.
If I threw one, it would probably land 5 feet from me.
Yeah, you and I would be, we would blow ourselves up. But,
I was wondering, what does Timothy Snyder mean by Russia knows Ukraine and likes Ukraine better than us? I mean, I was wondering what he meant by that.
Yeah, it's mostly invented. So, and it's not Putin. The czars all said the same thing. The czars celebrated the 1,000-year anniversary in 1886, because that in the year 886, that's when the Vikings landed in near Novosibirsk. And it's not just Putin. They all, when did Russian culture start? And true enough, the Orthodox, Russian Orthodox did start in Kyiv. A decade or two later with Valdemar. So Russians say Vladimir, the Ukrainians say Voldemar, the Great. They care because they have invented the past to make them care, and Putin has doubled down on that.
Well, I think we care too that Ukraine supplies so much fertilizer and grain to the rest of the world, and what happens to Ukraine and those products, don't you think?
Well, sure. I mean, the world cares. I don't know how much we need the Ukraine. I think our support is more ideological.
I don't mean we need it. It's just that we care that our allies would get it, Egypt and some of those places that they don't.
Yeah, I think our care is geopolitical, and our NATO allies. And I mean, the Baltic states really are anxious. And you see Finland and Sweden, they're anxious too. So Putin made that possible. Anyway. Yeah. Well, I guess we didn't get to California. But I thought this was so big.
Really, well, the other piece to think about is are the Russians running out of soldiers? Because they haven't, they have
Yes.
kind of a subterfuge going on about how they're getting their soldiers. They're giving them enormous bonuses because Putin hasn't been willing to instigate a draft, because that's going to let people know how bad it really is. And how
Yeah, I think they're paying them something like in the United States, we'd be paying a soldier $250,000 a year.
Yeah, they're, and my guess is that if you die, that doesn't go to your family, but how I think that's a piece. The other piece that also comes up, though, is the Russian people they have a very closed news system. It's all RT, so they don't really know what's going on, and we don't really know what's happening from that.
Yeah, I think that's generational. I think the younger people do know, and they're the ones that are going to get drafted. Now, they may not know in the rural areas. That's true, and they may get a lot of these rural guys to go. But
right, that's where they're getting their soldiers from.
Yeah, but
urban guys are not going.
But remember, they have not instituted a draft. Apparently, he is afraid to do that, having seen what the draft did to America in Vietnam.
Well, anyway, you wouldn't have a draft just for a special military operation, would you? I sound like I'm being sardonic, but it's still only in Russian propaganda a special military operation.
Yeah, don't say the war. Don't say war.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's like that Monty Python where the German tourists come and don't mention the war. You remember that?
Well, that was, I think, post Monty Python. I think it was the tourists arriving at.
Oh yeah, that was
the
faulty
hotel.
towers. Yeah, you're
Yeah,
right.
Faulty Towers.
Yeah, yeah. I stand corrected yet again.
Hard to keep track of all of these people and where my humor is coming from.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
interesting that, Putin is grabbing these Christian countries with Ukraine and Georgia, but he hasn't dared try to go into the Muslims countries yet.
Well, remember he cut his eye teeth on Chechnya.
Yeah, but with, Azerbaijan, they've got the oil. You'd think that, he would go into that, but man, that's like grabbing a.
He's there. Russian troops are all along that corridor with the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Russian troops are patrolling that corridor.
Oh, I know it, but the thing is that, it's interesting that he first went after those Christian countries, because, going after an Islamic country is another,
Well, he went into Kazakhstan when their elite was challenged by the mob. Now, religion didn't play a role in that.
bribery and
Yeah, I think it was about corruption and not religion.
Yeah.
But you're right. Okay, folks. Well, next week, come hell or high water, we're going to do California.
Okay.
maybe the drought will be so bad.
John, thank you. I had to step away for a little bit, so I'm gonna have to listen to the recording. I had someone at the front door I had to deal with, so I missed some of that, but fascinating. Thank you so much.
Well, the Ukraine had somebody at the front door that they're having to deal with too. So.
Really.
They're really eager for the to get to play it back and find out what happened.
Yes, indeed.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, John.
All right, see you next week.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.